Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast. That is, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch with Bill McGurn and Mary Anastasia O'Grady. We should mention, I'm happy to mention the Camp David Accords, the Israeli-Egypt peace agreement, which Carter had spent an enormous amount of time with his personal diplomacy to make happen. And that peace between those two countries has stood even to today, Mary.
Yeah, that's a very important accomplishment for Jimmy Carter. And when we were on the domestic issues, I don't think we mentioned the deregulation that he engaged in both in airlines and railroads, which was really important. But on the foreign front, I agree with Bill that, he was a good man. I mean, nobody's perfect, but he just seemed to have very bad judgment about totalitarianism and how evil another person could be. And we saw this particularly with Cuba and with Venezuela. In 2012, he called the Venezuelan electoral system the best in the world. And everybody knows they were stealing elections right and left. He did this big engagement with Cuba. He thought he could just sit down and talk like brother to brother with Fidel Castro. And it wasn't just that he did the wrong thing, but in doing it, he left a lot of really suffering people in Cuba and Venezuela with no U.S. leadership. So that was very costly to his legacy.
Often, Bill, Jimmy Carter is praised for his post-presidency. He built all of those homes for Habitat for Humanity. He was something of an envoy for human rights, which he had elevated into a major part of his foreign policy, really for the first time that American president had done that. Gerald Ford did a little bit with the Helsinki Accords, but Carter really pushed human rights. He did that in his post-presidency as well. But I think some of that is overdone in the sense that I think some of his foreign policy interventions, which were not welcomed even necessarily by Democratic successors. And the example that I think about is the nuclear program in North Korea, where Bill Clinton was trying to decide what to do. And Jimmy Carter kind of boxed him in by doing his own personal diplomacy that said, oh, well, they won't ever go to a nuclear bomb. And of course, they did that so-called framework accord that I think did, in fact, allow North Korea then to become nuclear. And that was a failed intervention by Carter.
Yeah, I think not only a failed intervention, I think, as you hinted, it really usurped the rights of the president. Bill Clinton, I was living in Asia at the time, so I remember it vividly. Bill Clinton went to the DMZ and pointed to North Korea and said, if you get nuclear weapons, it'll be the end of your country. Then Jimmy Carter popped in and, made it difficult for him. And I think that's the self-righteousness that we saw a lot from Carter. I acknowledge that his charitable works like Habitat for Humanity, good thing. But I think his policy interventions were still bad. I think he had a whole bunch of his staffers leave over his work on Israel and criticism of the Israelis and advocacy for the Palestinians. And a lot of his staffers left at one point. I don't think he was a good ex-president for those reasons. The charity aside, I give him full marks for that. But I think also there's something kind of sinister in always trying to say he was a good man. Basically, the comparison is to Reagan. So the implication is Reagan is not. But, when you're responsible for millions of people, what matters is the effect of your policy. Did Jimmy Carter actually improve human rights in any country? I mean, Mary could tell you better about Latin America. I don't think so. I think Reagan had a better record than that.
I think ultimately that's exactly right, because he helped the collapse of the Soviet Union not long after he left power. And of course, that collapse began during the Reagan term. His positions on Israel were really quite critical, and so much so that he almost he came very close in some of his comments to saying that the Palestinians are justified in using violence against Israel. Mary, do you have any kind of final thoughts about sort of Jimmy Carter's relevance for today?
Well, I would hope that his legacy is looked at in a more impartial way. I mean, obviously, he just died and people are trying to put the best light on it. But I do think that, as Bill says, I mean, he did a lot of damage, particularly after his presidency, in engagements with some of the worst players in the world and just flat out bad judgment. I wouldn't say that it was anything wrong with his character, but he was not a insightful leader either during his presidency or in the aftermath of his presidency.
Strength is something that you project or you don't. And when an American president projects weakness, whether it's by pulling out of Afghanistan or some other message early in a presidency, it can encourage adversaries and the bad guys to go on the march. I think Carter was an illustration of that. I think Biden is an illustration of that. But I don't want to leave without pointing out that I think the people who really undid the Carter presidency, events obviously played a big role, but the Democratic left. We can't forget that. And we can't forget what they did in Congress, making life so difficult for him, but also Ted Kennedy's challenge. Bill, I'm going to give you the last word on this. Ted Kennedy challenged him in the primaries and didn't beat him, but gave him a really rough time. And then there was the famous scene on the stage at the 1980 Democratic Convention where Kennedy gave that very, very grudging endorsement. And I think that hurt Carter.
Yeah, I think it did. I'm not sure, but I sort of remember, I don't think he shook his hand or something. He didn't do something that you would expect normally the two candidates to do. That hurt Carter. On the other hand, I'd look at that when Ted Kennedy entered the race. I was almost out of college, and I thought he's going to win. You know, Carter being so unpopular, I thought he's going to wipe the floor with Carter. And it shows Carter was kind of tough. He defeated Ted Kennedy. Yes, the president has a lot of powers and so forth, but against one of the most charismatic figures in the Democratic Party, Jimmy Carter prevailed.
All right, we'll leave it there for today with our reminiscences about the Carter presidency. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Bill. Thank you all for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch.